So I'm curious to hear about the Orum origin story. So we talked about it a little bit, right? But I think one of the most interesting things is it sounds like this was a product that was built out of necessity. So give us a little bit of the background. What's the origin story?
Yeah, absolutely. So as far as my background, which is kind of intertwined with the Orum origin story, is I started off as sort of the end user of our product as an SDR all the way back in 2010, and then was promoted into an account executive role. I made what was probably not the smartest decision, which was to leave that company with a friend who was an engineer, move to Silicon Valley, attempt to start a startup. And that company ended up in a small acqui-hire where they took the engineer, but not me. So I kind of had to figure out, like, what do I do next? So I go to start another company. Do I go back to my sales career? And I got really, really lucky and got sort of I really would say it's like the best of both worlds. So Bipul Sinha was a partner at Lightspeed at the time. He recruited me to be his first sales hire. And that was just a really transformative journey for me. So started off as an individual contributor, hitting the phones, trying to get our first customers, and then grew into a role where I built out our worldwide inside sales team and SDR team, and then later built our corporate sales team. So I ended up in a position where I was the buyer of this type of software. So naturally, I had a pretty large team. All the different sales tech vendors were trying to sell to me. And I think my frustration at the time was most of the tools were focused on managing and tracking sales reps, or in some cases, even creating work for the reps. It's kind of the old adage, like, make sure you do data entry in Salesforce, make sure you've updated it. And for me, I kept hiring more and more people, and I really wanted to buy a tool that empowered my sales rep and actually helped do the work for them. And the biggest problem that I had was I was hiring these really smart people out of college, and I was like, go make 100, 150 calls a day, because the phone was a very successful channel for us. And it was just this very difficult, mind-numbing sort of manual process.
So did you have people back then where they had a spreadsheet open or maybe working off the CRM and then manually punching in the numbers? Was that?
Oh yeah, so we're basically manually dialing the phone, and then you go into Salesforce.
The good old days, dude.
Update it. It was very much the good old days. And our marketing leader actually had convinced me to purchase a dialer, which turned out to be a pretty good idea. But back then, they're very rudimentary power dialers. They're still pretty manual. They weren't integrated in any type of strategic process. And then later, I bought one of the outsourced service providers that has human agents that make calls on your behalf. Once they connect with someone, it transfers over to the rep. It's like a Windows 95 looking interface, and it's like very expensive. And so I was kind of like, there has to be a better way. And so I met my co-founder, Karthik, who's a Stanford-trained engineer, and I sort of pitched him this idea. It's like, hey, can we build something that's as powerful as this outsourced service provider, but do it with AI and software rather than this man-in-the-machine model, and then plug it into things like outreach, sales law, the rest of this emerging sales tech stack, so reps can be strategic, and it kind of follows along the workflow that you already have. And he was able to build a prototype pretty quickly that was at least half as good as what I was paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for. So we were pretty sure at the beginning, like, maybe we're onto something.
So there's a couple things in your journey. I think there are some really good lessons for people. And the first thing is, like, knowing what you know now, if you had to be an SDR all over again, year one, what would be your advice to yourself to get started really quickly and to get promoted quickly?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Like, when I got out of college, like, the economy was like very much in the dumps. It was right after the 2008 crisis. And so for me, I was just like of the mindset, I was like, I hope they don't fire me. Like, I'm going to work as hard as I can. I was in the library, like, studying cloud computing, which is sort of the thing that I was selling, like, on the weekends, just to make sure I was really, really sharp at my job. But I think too, like, my advice for SDRs that are early on in their careers is people really, they overestimate what they can do in 1 year, but they underestimate what they can do in 5 years. And I remember just being anxious about getting promoted, getting the next stage. And story I like to tell is, like, one of our sales leaders came in and he was like, hey, I know you guys are all anxious about getting to the AE role, but it's only like a year or two, like, don't worry about it. And in my 22-year-old head, I was like, a year? That's like half my life. I'm like, I can't wait a year. And I looked back and, like, none of that mattered at all. And at the end of the day, you're learning really valuable skills as an SDR. You're learning to handle objections. You're learning to think on your feet. And those are things that I still do today when I'm talking to venture capitalists, when I'm talking to employees. So I think the main thing, not to overcomplicate it, is you just you study really hard, you try and outwork everyone else in the room, and then eventually you get promoted when the company has, when you're ready and when the company has an opening.
Yeah. I think that industry acumen is so important because my first sales job was going door to door selling house painting services. And the first thing I did is I went to, Barnes and Noble at the time. I bought a sales book for dummies, and then I bought a house painting book for dummies. So I knew how house painting worked.
College Works painting?
Yeah. So there's a couple of people at Orum that used to work there, I think, actually, or have friends of people.
So actually, Sarah, who is one of our enterprise account managers, she was also one of my early SDRs at Rubric.
Yeah.
And, she was really successful at College Works paintings and all those like Cutco, all those college sales jobs. And I had a few of those sort of pre-career sales jobs as well, doing like telemarketing when I was in college, and even in high school, I had a few of those jobs, and like they're tough, but you learn a lot. And it's funny, I had also picked up a sales book as well when I was trying to figure that out. I think when I was in college, and I remember one of the pieces of advice was just like count every single no that you get, because that means you're statistically more likely or closer to getting to a yes. So I think that's like a really interesting mindset, rather than having the no to motivate you, just thinking of it as just getting statistically closer to a good outcome.
Let's talk about that real quick, because I think one thing that is very, very hard for SDRs, especially early on, and any salespeople that are doing cold outreach, is the rejection. And when you think about the average success rate on a connected cold call is about 5%. So 95% of the time you're getting rejected, and you have a better chance statistically of getting into Harvard than booking a meeting on a cold call when you think about it like that. And I don't think that people underestimate the mental toll of being on the receiving end of that much rejection on a daily basis. What's helped you in that area, and what advice would you have for reps around just like getting through the like day-to-day grind of getting told no so much?
Yeah, first I'll say that like it's definitely possible to control that conversion rate. I think it's surprising. I mean, there are reps when, they're doing really well that have like a 30-40% conversion rate. Almost half the people they're talking to are taking a meeting with them. So I think having some faith that it is a skill and it's not predetermined and you can change that outcome. But certainly like there's a lot of mental toughness that's involved in sales in general, especially in the SDR role, because there is definitely a mental tax for a bunch of people being unhappy that you reached out to them, unhappy with what you have to say, and then telling you to, take a hike, essentially. So I think there are like some innate personality traits that salespeople have that allow them to endure that. Like, a common stereotype is like athletes. Like a lot of being an athlete is doing really, really hard training to get at something bigger in the end game. But I think the important thing, and what I coach, is if you have a bad call, making sure that you reset yourself so you don't bring that into the next call. Because it's kind of like basketball where you miss a shot and then you start missing every shot. And so your tonality sounds different. The same way that if you book a meeting, that's the best time to make 100 calls, because that's when you have the pep in your step. You're like, everyone wants this thing. So it is very psychological. But part of being in sales is being able to handle that rejection.
So what do you personally do, if you don't mind sharing, after, let's say you got back-to-back meetings and you've had a meeting that didn't go that well and you're maybe a little flustered? What do you do to recover from that before the next meeting?
I mean, I think at this point, I'm pretty callous to it. Just after many, many years. So I think for me, it's probably just suck it up. But I think it's also about being self-aware and really monitoring your own attitude. And, if you get off a really, really bad call, and that happens when you have a back-to-back day on Zoom. I mean, you can get off, it could also just be like an internal thing within the company that's negative and is psychologically bothering you. And then you have to be in front of a customer, right on the next call. So I think the main thing is just, self-monitoring, being aware, and trying to control your tonality at the end of the day. I think people can pick that up. But
so part of that I'm hearing too is just having faith that part of this is just experiencing and just doing it a bunch and being willing to fail.
Yeah, I definitely think it's part personality. Like I think for some people, like sales is not for everyone. I think it's like what I'm trying to say is
outbound especially is not for everyone.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, outbound and being an SDR, like it does take and that kind of goes back to recruiting, which I think is really the most important thing for an SDR leader to think about, but like it does take a specific set of personality traits to be really successful, like this type of sales. And then a lot of it is just experience. Like once you've been rejected for the 1,000th time, like it probably hurts less. Is what I would think. But it's just a part of it. And I think keeping the big picture in mind, like again, like every no is getting you closer to a yes. It's a part of, thinking about it as a part of the process.
Yep. You have to eat shit, as they say, in order to get to the good stuff. Because we've been talking about calling. Let's talk about the actual cold call. And I think what I want to get into is, because we've, Outbound Squad has been partnered with Orum for a couple of years now, and we're very big fans of the platform. And when I'm talking to our clients and trying to get them to use Orum, one of the questions they have is, well, if reps are dialing through numbers like this quickly, how are they able to tailor and like do a good call still when it's happening at such a rapid pace? And for anyone that's watching or listening that hasn't used a dialer before, it's like you're almost like short of breath. You're talking to so many people over the course of an hour. Can we break down the call a little bit? How do you think about, the first 30 to 60 seconds is where most calls are won and lost. What should a rep be thinking about in that first 30 seconds once the prospect says hello?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. I think the first thing is, obviously Orum started off as a parallel dialer. Since then we've broadened. We have a power dialing product. We have click to call within our system. And I think depending on the circumstance, the list, the skill of the rep, should determine the speed at which you dial. And obviously the deliverability, like what's your connect rate. But I certainly think that as reps get more skilled and as you take away a lot of the manual work, reps can be really successful with auto dialing and with dialing really quickly. And even if they haven't done a bunch of individual preparation for each call that they make, I think the biggest thing and a big part of the training that I did at my previous company is getting to know the product and the industry really, really, really well, because it's very apparent to the person you're talking to, whether you know what you're talking about. So I think people get hung up a little bit on pre-call research where it's like, hey, Jason, I saw this post you made on Twitter 5 years ago and that you went to UC Santa Barbara anyways, and then they go into this like canned pitch. I think when someone gets a cold call, insofar that they want to get cold called, I think like the main thing is they want to know that you are the specific target of their outreach, that they're actually trying to get a hold of you. They're not randomly fishing, and they want you to get to the site. And so I think those are the two things to keep in mind. So as long as you really can convey that, and I have some like tips and tricks on like how to do that, but as long as you can convey that and you really know your stuff, it's very rare to get a call from someone who is an industry peer who could really have something interesting to say. So that's how you stand out. So it's not so much about the speed, but it's more so about the content and how do you handle yourself on the call.
100%. It's the thing that I always talk about is in sales, you start from behind the starting line. It's like politicians and lawyers are probably the only other two occupations I could think of off the top of my head where you start from a place of distrust, where people have an inherent distrust of people that they get cold called from. So your job is to like reduce skepticism. And a big way that you do that is by knowing your stuff, like knowing the industry, knowing their problems, people like them, et cetera. So let's get into some of the how-to. Like what are some of the more tactical things in terms of how I should open, my tonality, all of that kind of stuff? What should I be thinking about?
Yeah, you might find this interesting. So I do a training for some of our customers. It's based on one of the trainings I did at my last job. And the way that I open up the training is I put salesperson. What are the words that come to mind? And like everyone kind of raised their hand. They're like liar. They're
pushy.
Like, pushy. I'm like, whoa, like settle down here. Like we're here to learn about sales. And then you put up the statement, people buy from X and Y. And like, they come to the conclusion. It's like, well, you buy from people that you like and trust. And then we go like, okay, like what makes you likable and what makes you trustworthy? And we kind of like get rid of this stigma of like, okay, these negative stigmas that are associated with salespeople, those are actually just bad salespeople. And this is what a good salesperson looks like, because that is where the good tonality comes from. That's how you build confidence over the phone, is kind of the Zig Ziglar, like being proud to be a salesperson. So I think people jump straight to the, what are the tips and tactics? What's the one opening line that you have? And they don't actually build up like the right mindset leading up to that. From there, so I always try and build that first before getting into like what's the thing you say to open up the call, or how do you handle this objection? But once we've kind of like established that, I like to lay out sort of a map or a framework, not so much like a procedure of like, this is what you do step by step on the call, but a map to help them like understand like where they are in the conversation so they understand what to do next. And so that starts off with a hinge, which is sort of a statement about the person, the bridge, which is connecting that statement for the reason for the call. If you've done that well, you've caught their attention, then you're going to go into needs discovery, which is sort of sales 101, where you're uncovering pain, you're uncovering goals, you're letting them speak most of the time, building up likability and trust. And then through that, you're going to do objection handling and ultimately find the right lever to set up the next step.
So I'm so anxious to dig like deep into those, but you mentioned likability and trustworthiness. Likability is one of these things I feel like that people, it's like they completely discount. And it's like, people might buy from someone that they maybe don't necessarily like because the solution is really good, but rarely do I ever hear people talking to someone on a cold call that they just don't like. It's almost an immediate gut reaction that I just don't want to give this person the time of day. And almost like being on the receiving end, it's really easy for me to dehumanize someone that I don't like. So when you mention likability, how does someone think about likability? What is a way that they could be more likable when they interact with someone for the first time like that? Because I think this is a really underestimated skill. It's the art of cold calling that is very hard to teach.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it can vary. You know, it's like if you're calling into the South, like sometimes that means you have great manners.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's a lot of little things. Like when someone brings up an objection, are you like pausing, or are you like talking over them? Like in some cases, depending on the context, are you using humor? Are you fun to talk to? Are you upbeat? When the customer brings up a point, are you listening and then complimenting them for that point? Or are you just like racing to sort of pitch over them? So I think all those little things add up, and like we all know what it feels like when it's the opposite of that, where you just like, you know, you're in the car dealership and you're just getting the ick and you're like, I need to get out of here. And they're just pushy. So it's whatever the opposite of that is sort of what makes a salesperson both likable and trustworthy. But I try, you know, when we're hiring sales reps, like we're looking for some of those traits innately. And so I try, and I've had sales reps that are like so likable in person. They get on the phone, they're so nervous and so wound up, and it's like they sound like a totally different
They turn into a different human. Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's really just about humanizing the conversation a little bit. So one of the we call it a pre-hinge, but just a way to say the same thing every single time someone picks up the phone, helps build confidence, sort of even before you go into the hinge. So the one that Colin, our head of sales, uses quite frequently, as you probably noticed as well, is like, hey, they keeping you busy on this Tuesday?
Yeah.
Because it's kind of fun. It's kind of upbeat. You're sort of acknowledging the pattern interrupt.
Yeah.
But everyone asks for a script, and I think scripts can be good training tools, but it's not a script. Like that's not what's actually happening when someone's good at this.
Yeah. Colin is a perfect example of exactly what you're talking about, likable and trustworthy. He exudes that from the moment that you start talking with him. And I think like the mastering the first impression is so powerful, you know, with a call. So if we break down the framework a bit, so the hinge, can we break that down? What is the hinge? What are we trying to accomplish there?
Yeah, so I think the hinge can be a lot of different things, and it's really just any statement about the prospect.
Okay.
Like to lead into the call. And sometimes it can have components of pre-call research, but sometimes it can be as simple as like, hey, Bob, this is Jason from Orum. You know, I'm reaching out to you specifically, and just kind of name, like, I think at the end of the day, it can just be an opening that says this is why you're reaching out to them. I think people really overcomplicate this. There's like permission-based openers, there's all these different things, but I think it's really just about opening naturally. And there's little things like, so if I say, hey, John, I know you're leading a large IT team over at Basecamp. That's different than saying, hey, John, I saw that you're the VP of IT, where it looks like you're just reading off a list. So saying I know, there's some implication there that they're the specific target of your outreach. Yeah. So even without a lot of pre-call research, there's like little hints and things you can do with your language that make it flow a lot better. But I've seen people open up cold calls, all sorts of different things, sports references and I think tonality and the context matters a lot more than some like magical opener that someone uses. Whatever gives you the most confidence is probably the best thing to open the call with.
Yeah, opening with confidence. And the second thing that I'm kind of picking up there too is after I introduce myself as quickly as possible, if I can shift the conversation over to the other person, that's where it starts to get pretty powerful. There's a stat that I like to reference a lot. I always ask when I'm training reps is, what percentage of the time should you spend talking versus the prospect? And most of the time they say, well, you should only talk 10 or 20% of the time or whatever. And I show data from Gong that says that reps that schedule meetings, they actually talk a little bit more than the prospect. And it's not necessarily about talk time. It's about the content of the conversation. Are you making it more about them? Talking more about them versus pitching your stuff. So we have the first part of the call, and then there's the bridge. So what's the bridge?
Yeah, the bridge is just connecting the hinge for the reason for your call.
Got it.
So at the end of the day, it's a statement about them, why you're reaching out to them, and then connecting that to the reason you reached out. And that's pretty much.
And how do you recommend a rep thinks about the reason for the call? What is the reason for the call?
Well, it can depend, but I think it's trying to think of a good example here. But I think it's just like, hey, the reason I'm reaching out to you specifically is I know you're leading this large team and we have technology that, and then we kind of plug in what we call the teaser, which is the sort of one, not the full pitch, but sort of the one sexy thing about your product that catches people's attention.
Yeah.
With the idea that after that, hopefully you get them to talk. But I really like for the opener, I really try not to overcomplicate it that much. You just introduce yourself. You kind of make it known that you're reaching out to them specifically. You give them the reason for your call, depending on so like in the case of Orum, for example, it's like, hey, I know you're leading a large SDR team. We have a platform that helps your reps get into more live conversations over the phone, and want to get a hold of you specifically because I know that that's what your team's doing all day. It can be any version of that. I botched my version of that a little bit, but it's just really, I think it's just about opening it just naturally and fluidly, depending on what their position is, what you're selling.
And then from there, problem discovery. That's where I'm going to have a couple questions maybe on like what kind of tooling they might be using or what kind of objections they run across or their pickup rates or whatever it might be.
Yeah, and like the end of the bridge, like you could say something along the lines of like, I'm curious like how you've been thinking about these types of tools.
Yeah.
And you might get yes, no, maybe something, and then you have a natural conversation from there. I think when you get out of the hinge and bridge into needs discovery, like that's when the prospect's not in hang up mode anymore. They're just in a conversation.
You're actually having a conversation
with you
at that point.
And it's all backed up by like, do you know a lot about the product in this space? Because like, I'm coming from IT where if you call an IT person and like you barely know what a server is, like you don't know what storage is, like you don't know any of that stuff, then you're in for a rough time. You're going to be really nervous. They're going to start bringing up all these different tools. And that's when things really fall apart. But it's not hard to have a conversation. Like if you're a car person, you're a car nerd, and you talk to another car nerd, like you're going to be able to have I'm actually selling a car right now and I have all these car nerds calling me and we're on the phone for like 20 minutes, so it's, I think that's the main thing.
So I want to pick your brain just a bit on the questions. The thing that I always say is, we've been given advice in our careers oftentimes that there's no such thing as a stupid question, but in sales, you can ask stupid questions, right? Questions that show that you don't really know much about them or the industry, that sort of stuff. What's your advice for questions in terms of that middle part of the call, making sure that you ask great questions?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a lot of, I think, the classic sales stuff. It's open-ended questions like, walk me through, right? Or like, and I think actually a good tip here that kind of goes beyond the basic stuff that I learned from one of my sales coaches is sort of this tone of curiosity that kind of gets people to talk. So it's like, Joe, like, I'm curious, like, how do you guys go about this? It's that sort of tonality that really gets people like wanting to speak to you. And I think, and I've also had reps ask like, well, can I have a list of open-ended questions? It's like, you should be curious about like what's going on. And I think like that combination of product knowledge and like the curiosity is where a lot of that really stems from. So I don't think you have to be like super conscious about like, I got to ask a specific open-ended question. It's like, you have to be able to like think on your feet and really like read the room.
Yeah. So how can, if we shift gears a bit, this acumen piece is a really big part of the equation that you talk about. How do you recommend sales leaders and enablement folks that are developing onboarding programs, what do you recommend they do to get people up to speed really quickly on how the industry works and like the problem that they solve and how they position themselves and all that stuff?
Yeah, I think one of the things about SDR organizations today is I see so much of the training is like, this is how you use the tools, and it's like very operational, and they stray away from traditional actual like salesmanship training and also just the product knowledge. One interesting idea that we had at my previous company was we were doing a sort of pitch contest as people got closer to the next step of becoming an account executive. And we started doing that the first month that they were on the job. And we would have like, the head of sales or like some other people that were like going to eventually, or an RD, someone who was going to recruit them onto their team.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is like when you're in college, you're studying for a physics final, you're studying for a math final, like people can like learn a lot in a semester.
Yeah.
And so what would happen was they were like, oh my God, I just got this job. In a month, I'm going to be like running a mock discovery call with the VP of sales and the RD, the people whose team I want to be on eventually. And guess what they do? They go and they like really study, they get to know this stuff. And one of two things happen. Either they do great and then like the RD is like, I want this person on my team. And you're like, whoa, they've only been on my team for 3 months. Or like they fail and they're not asking you about when I'm going to be promoted to AE because I know they have work to do. But it creates sort of a, I've always just felt like, because sometimes you talk to SDRs who are in a position for like 2 years and you ask them about the product and it's like they still don't have like a great answer for you.
Oh, that drives me crazy.
I feel like the bar's pretty low. It's really, people go through school, they're studying all sorts of complex things. It's like, yeah, you should know what this like cloud storage product does after a month.
It's like you don't even need to know how to use it, but you should know what it does and what problem it solves.
Yeah, I've had that scenario. So at my previous company, I went to some of the adjacent companies. And I saw these SDRs that were there for 2 years, and I'm like, oh, it's gonna be easy. I'm just gonna hire them, and they're gonna like know everything. And I started to interview them, and like some of them knew less about the product than when I had figured out on like the website 20 minutes before, just digging through it. So I ended up hiring a lot of entry level people, just because I figured, hey, like I feel like I can train these people pretty quickly myself. And
you were looking for, it sounds like, those natural kind of skills and personality traits. That's really the more important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely like a subtle art to interviewing. And I think the big thing about recruiting too is just having a very, very high bar. And I think the best recruiters are kind of like, they're critical almost to the point of being jerks in a way, because not like your goal is not just to like give everyone a chance. Your goal is to hire the most elite people you can possibly find that really, really impress you. And your job for all the mistakes that I made as an SDR leader, like the one thing that everyone will kind of admit that I did well was like hiring the right people. And also that also means that you have to get a lot of people in the door and you're sussing out entry level talent.
Could you give us one quick hiring tip? Because I've interacted with a lot of the team at Orum, and they're all just freaking rock stars.
Yeah.
Is there a tip that you have for other sales leaders out there that are thinking about, how do I build a world-class organization and get like really good talent in?
Yeah, there's a lot there, and it depends on the position. I think it really comes down just to like making sure your standards are through the roof. I think there's like a psychological thing where it's like, well, this person's so great, they wouldn't want to work here, right? They wouldn't want to work for me. And I think like kind of getting that out of your head and going like, no, like we only hire people that are the most elite people.
Yeah.
I think that's the first thing. And I think as far as like sales interviews, there's ways to test for people's innate storytelling abilities, and also like one of my favorite questions, like, give me an example of a time that you did something that was really, really challenging or hard where you came out on top or as number one. And like the really good people, they have like exceptional stories. Like I had one, Sarah, who we talked about earlier, she was like the number one person on the West Coast for like CollegeWorks painting. And like, I'm like, okay, like that's interesting. Yeah. And it's like, if the story is just kind of like a plain vanilla story and there's nothing like really cool there, then it's like, okay, like, I think what happens then is people go, but they were good though. They seem like pretty smart. And there's like these little justifications you do in your head that end up having you hire average people when you really have to be like a bit of elitist. Like you have to hire the best people. And I've worked with SDR managers where they're very much in the mode of like, they're like, well, they seem like a nice person. Let's just give them a chance. And like, as a human being, I'm like, that's awesome. As like a sales manager, you need to be like, I was absolutely blown away. This person's amazing.
Yeah.
And it's just a different mindset.
Totally.
Altogether.
Totally. So we got time to go through one more topic here quickly. Calendar blocking is something that we wanted to get into. Do you have any kind of insight around, like, as a rep? Dude, I find one of the hardest things right now is just managing all the distractions in a virtual environment for most people. It's like, how do I be productive outside of an office? But any tips for productivity, time management, that sort of things for reps?
I probably need to work on my own calendar, but the advice I'd give to reps, like, in particular when I was managing an AE team, like, I think for AEs, it's like they're busy doing all these other things. And so they don't have a lot of time to do top of funnel work, to prospect, to do all of that. And so the saying that we had is like, if it's not on your calendar, it's not important to you. And so it's like, you'll see someone's calendar and it's like, they got lunch, they got like the gym, they got like these other things, but it's like, where's your cold call block? Where's your prospecting block? So I think if you have a rep that at least is like struggling with that, I think like a good thing to do is to try and structure their calendar and have them hold themselves accountable. I think another example of that is like SDRs who need to make calls early in the morning when the pickup rates are high. Like just holding yourself accountable to that can like really change the outcome. But yeah, I think another thing too is like in my position, and then also when I was a manager, you kind of can't have a structured calendar in a way because you're getting pulled in a bunch of different directions. So I feel like if you're an individual contributor, an SDR, an AE, like that's actually a superpower. The fact that you get to like have really regimented with your time, because you're not just a resource for everyone else. Like you're an individual contributor. So I think, if I went back to being an IC, I would definitely like structure out my day like in a really defined way. Now people just book over everything on my calendar and I get pulled in a million different directions. And
so lastly, great advice. Any advice for the revenue leaders? So people that are in those frontline leadership positions, the more senior leaders, in terms of like the more specific question I think would be like making sure that they have time to, as a CEO, you want to be able to spend time working on the business, not just in the business in these meetings all of the time. I'm sure you set aside some time to do more strategic thinking and bigger projects. How do you recommend sales leaders make time for that? Because it is a game of, as soon as you log in, there's tons of Slacks and emails and a bunch of stuff where you have to be in this really responsive state. How do you recommend that they make time for some of the more important stuff?
I think like a frontline manager and a second line manager, it's like, I think it's a little bit different in terms of how they spend their time. But I think that I think the higher up the chain you go, there's like a huge diversity of like what you could be spending your time on. And I've kind of fell into this trap myself where it's like, you can get to the end of the day or the end of the week and be like, oh my God, I was like so insanely busy. And then you look back and like, what actually was like the thing that like moved the needle? Sometimes like the most important thing I've done in a week was like call one of my friends at 6 p.m. who's also an entrepreneur and get like, a little tidbit of advice that like changed the way I thought about something. And it wasn't like me sitting there writing a massive enablement document for the team that took me 6 hours or something like that. So I think that the higher up you get, like the more you have to choose. But I think for at least like frontline sales leaders, I think focusing on the basics, like who you hire is the number one most important thing. And like the second thing is training. And then from there, it's about like retention, like team morale. And sometimes I think frontline leaders, they get too caught up with like the tools or the operations or some of the cross-functional stuff, which is important, but that's not the main thing. Like the main thing is who you hire and, do they have the tools they need to be successful? And focusing on the people. That's what managers are there for. It's to enable the people at the end of the day.
And where can people go to check out more about Orum, learn about what you guys are up to, all that kind of good stuff?
Well, Orum.com, our LinkedIn page. So YouTube channel.
We got to blow up
all over the internet.
That's right. Cool.
Cool.